Please be seated. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all. Before I jump into some reflection on the day, I want to encourage those of you who wear hearing aids who have not been able to hear for a long time to use that T-coil function that's been fixed since maybe the last time you were here. Ron, I'm thinking about you, looking at you. If you need to flick that on and it wasn't working for you before, it may be working for you now. And so just check that out before I get started here. All right, let me get started here. A few years back, I had the privilege of accompanying a number of young people from the church that I was ministering in on what we would normally call a mission trip, but we started referring to them really as missionary pilgrimages. In that, we knew that we would be going to participate in the mission of God, so mission trip. But we also knew that God was already up to some amazing things in the places that we were going, and we were being invited to witness the holiness of the place that we were traveling to. And so, a pilgrimage. That's what you do on pilgrimage, right? We were going to Charlotte, North Carolina, and we had this opportunity to partner with an organization out of Myers Park Presbyterian Church there. They would help us partner then with their partners and get to be around in Charlotte witnessing some of the work that God was doing in the community. So if somebody were to come here and do that, for instance, they would end up going back out in little groups of teenagers to visit with NFCC, for instance, to see what a collection of community charities looks like when it's trying to make a difference in someone's life, or what transitional housing might look like from the perspective of Drake House, or one of dozens of other ministries that are happening in our surrounding area. For each different group, there was something that was particularly exciting. For the group that I had, we were really eager for our last day. On our last day, we were going to the Greyhound bus station. And we knew we were going to see all sorts of things there, but we were especially excited to encounter asylum seekers who were traveling through Charlotte. More on that in a moment. We were going to offer love to whomever we encountered anyway. We spent the morning, though, making burritos and care packages, writing prayer cards for these people on that journey. Asylum seekers are often on a pretty unforgiving and perilous journey. Most of them would have crossed the border somewhere with Mexico and then been on buses throughout the country to one of the places where there is an asylum or immigration court. There are 3 in Atlanta, there's 1 in Charlotte. They're spread around the country. And Charlotte would have been a destination for some, but for others, they would have gone maybe to another place where they had friends or family that could provide shelter and hospitality while they were waiting for their case to be heard. Some of them would turn and try to go somewhere else where the court had a tendency to be more favorable to the plight of those coming from their original location. In any case, the bus trips were long. And maybe if it's been a little while for you, you don't quite remember that long Greyhound bus trips aren't always fun. They've gotten worse. I'm not picking on Greyhound, by the way, but there's been more competition. It's been a harder and harder industry to provide a lot of great service in. And so these folks have been station by station in some pretty inhospitable places, and it's a long and arduous journey. So we wanted to provide relief where relief could come, just acknowledgement of their human dignity where that was needed, prayer and support if we could. And we were so disappointed when we got there and found out that their bus had been delayed. We weren't going to meet any of them. We weren't going to hear any stories, we weren't going to visit with them, and we weren't going to be there to give them the care packages that we had spent the morning making. So while we were there, we thought, well, you know what? There are other people here. Let's take a moment to say hello to them. We'll give a care package or 2 out. And we did. There was a young girl there, about 10 years old, from El Salvador, if memory serves. And she was a recipient of one of our care packages. And she thanked us And then went back into conversation with her mom. She peeked into the bag a little bit to see what might have been in there. She held on to her care package and went. And we left our kind of group leader there who would stay there with our care packages for when the bus would finally arrive. Later on, we checked in with our group leader and said, all right, well, what ended up happening? And she told us about how things went down, but the thing that she most reflected on is that after we left, there were some other buses that arrived. And on each bus, there would be another child, similar to the 10-year-old that we encountered. That 10-year-old would reach into her bag and find some small thing that she could share with the next person through the doors. We went hoping to encounter something holy, to see something of God's love working in the world. We hoped that we would participate in it, and we got what we asked for. As we all know, in our society, asylum seekers and immigrants are often cast in the worst light, and they're often lumped together into one big uniform group without any care for individual story or circumstance. That's sometimes informed by our tribalism or our nationalistic tendencies, sometimes by our prejudice, sometimes by outright racism. Such was the case with the relationship between the Jewish people and the Samaritans. For hundreds of years, there was animosity, hatred, and even when it wasn't animosity or hatred, there was an inability to understand the circumstances and nuances of any individual story. That's just a part of that group of other people that we don't like because we're on the other side of this line. They found it easier to hate each other often than they did to find ways to love each other. That's important to know as we begin to explore our story today. When Jesus is confronted by an astute and learned man of the law, he's confronted by somebody who probably isn't looking to the Samaritan people for exemplary people, upright and righteous. He probably doesn't think that highly of them most of the time. This is a man who wanted to find life, real life, not the thing that we settle on from time to time, but that good new life of the new age that Jesus was ushering in. He already knew what the law said. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. He was familiar with those words already. Yes, Lord, but just to be sure that I dot all of my I's and cross all of my T's, let's be clear about this. Who is my neighbor? It might have been better if he hadn't asked, right? I usually don't want to ask. Here's what I've learned. Every time I ask, God always expands my understanding. My neighbors are these. Yeah, but they're also these. No, I don't like those. It doesn't matter. Does this person get to be included in the group? Does this person have to be included in the group? I really would prefer to not have to treat this person as my neighbor. Yes, Remington, them too. This poor guy didn't know any better. And so he says, who is my neighbor? And ooh, Jesus delivers, doesn't he? Not with an answer that would have met him where he is in his area of specialty, right? They could have disputed the law. He could have argued about all sorts of things about Moses' intent or God's intent with the people as they entered into the promised land. None of that. Nope. If you were arguing with me, I would have said, well, tell me more about the etymology of this word neighbor. By the way, the Hebrew word means something more like associate or other than it means, like the person living next door. That's not what it means. Love others as you love yourself is a more accurate translation, and it gets lost in the Greek. I want to talk about that, not actually loving my neighbor, right? Maybe you're like me in that. I don't know. I would much rather talk about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin than actually doing the work sometimes. Well, the guy didn't know any better. He asks. Jesus gives him a demonstration in his parable. The ones who know better than anybody else, perhaps, what it looks like to follow the law and to honor the Levitical code, who know what it means to love one's associates, they fail to do so. When someone's life is on the line, they fail to do so, and who knows why? Traditionally, we have understood that maybe it's because they were trying to avoid some kind of impurity, that they thought the person was already dead. But the law would have demanded that they find out and that they do what they can to help. By their own standard, they're being negligent. They should have provided help. Saving a life ends up trumping all of the other laws anyway. Saving a life trumps all of the other laws. If you don't believe me, here's the thing that's kind of fun. I learned this back when I was a chaplain intern at a hospital. Have you ever heard of porcine bioprosthetic heart valves? Huh? That's the fancy medical term for replacement heart valves made from pigs. Pigs aren't kosher. Can Jewish people receive porcine bioprosthetic heart valves? You better believe they can. Absolutely. Because those kosher laws go out the window when it's time to save somebody's life. That's the law. If ritual impurity was their concern, they might have been more concerned that they actually abide by the law that tells them to save a life. Turns out that what's inadmissible in their life, the Samaritan, from an ethnic group and a situation in life that is, well, often grouped together for the Jewish people in the first century in such a way that the individual loses their story and their circumstances and instead is just part of a group that we don't like. That's the one who crosses the road and saves this man's life. This is the one who honors Leviticus, the one who acts like a neighbor, the one who shows mercy and love. And if you really want life in the new age, if you really want life to its fullest, if you really want to live, go and do likewise. For me and for the teenagers that I chaperoned in Charlotte, we believed ourselves to already be on the right side of parables like this, right? We were going out of our way to share love with one another and with the people that we would encounter. And good for us, right? We didn't walk out of our encounter suddenly believing that we were somehow less than. I'm not entirely sure that the lawyer that Jesus encounters would have walked away from that suddenly feeling like, well, gosh, I've been missing it all this time. But instead, we realize that we were often blinded to who could be our true teacher. We weren't blindly walking by the suffering of our neighbor, but the world had developed in a lot of us a neglectful attitude toward our neighbor. And seeing their full capacity to teach us something of the gospel, if we were going to be on pilgrimage, we needed to see what was being offered. And we did, and we learned. We were taught to see by someone who is, well, often easy to ignore, and that the world often teaches us to ignore, for any one of these many categories. An immigrant, at this point potentially undocumented still, a person of color, a child, a woman, or a child, a girl. No social means. She didn't speak English. Those, and for many, many, many other reasons, we're taught to ignore people. Don't you have people in your life that for whatever reason you think, they can't teach me anything? Gosh, that's a dangerous spiritual place to be in when we start to look at somebody else and say, I have nothing to learn from you. In a lot of our political discourse, by the way, that's one of our major problems, is that we look at each other and say, I can't possibly learn anything from that person. They're on the other side of the aisle or this issue from me. Dangerous place for us to be spiritually. If we want to find ways to love, and as a result, if we want to find ways to live, we have to see. To see in the other the capacity to teach us how to love and how to live. And so we did look, and we did see, and we did learn. And we walked away perhaps with more courage to go and do likewise. And that's my hope for each of us. We're surrounded with opportunities to go and do likewise. Right? The recipient of the care wasn't a Samaritan. You don't have to pick the hardest person in your life to figure out who to love, but maybe that's beneficial. Maybe that person's in the room with you right now. Maybe the person's in your family. Maybe the person is your literal neighbor. It probably depends on how they acted on July 4th. Right? Maybe it's somebody that you have an ongoing disagreement with about their politics or something else. Who knows? I don't know. I know that for each of us, there's somebody that frequently tests our ability to show mercy, because that's part of what it is to be human. We're also surrounded with opportunities to learn in all sorts of different ways, yes, from one another, but also from people who have been living on the margins. We're provided with icons and images of how to love one another, and it's often the case that when we go to the margins, we see that Jesus is already there. We go there on pilgrimage. We find ways to love again, find ways to learn how to be better neighbors. If we want life in the fullest, we want to really know what life means, let us learn to be better neighbors. Let's cross boundaries of division, wherever they may be, and care for one another. And let's learn, especially from those that we are often taught to ignore. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy